Hey everybody, it's Chief Meteorologist Brad Panovich here. So the question I've been getting a lot today, what happened to the Arctic air coming in next week? Because a couple days ago, looks like we've got a blast early in the week, and the last, I'd say 36, 24 hours or so, the models are starting to flip-flop a little bit. It's a really interesting pattern. It's not that the cold air vanished, it's that it's changing the timing and the intensity of it, and it's really a chaotic pattern. There's no other way to really describe what's going on. So I'm going to try to explain what's happening and tell you what is going to happen, or at least I think is going to happen next week, and it's going to be a wild ride. So here's the upper level pattern. If I can get it to show up, let's see if it'll show up here. There we go. There's the upper level pattern. So you can see we've got the nor'easter, which is moving away from us right now. That nor'easter is right over here. It's moving away, but this cold air is just lurking up here in Canada. And I'm going to go into the future, and you can see a big surge of this tries to come down this weekend. And it looks like some of it makes it into the Midwest and up into the Great Lakes region, but that's really cold air. But what this does is when the cold air dives south, it's got a couple options. One, it can dive straight down into the heart of the U.S., it can dive down into the Carolinas like it looked like it was going to do a couple days, or it could come down and do one of these. So there's actually three options, and the models are struggling with which option is going to work out. The problem is these other two options here, if it dives to the south or even sits up here, it causes a lot of ridging to develop over the Atlantic and the Pacific. You can actually see that. So those are warm temperatures. We're kind of in between this battleground. So we've got potentially really warm air off to the east of the ocean, super cold air up here, and here we are in between, and a shift east or west of that pattern can cause wild swings in the weather, and that's what's happening right now. You can see as we go through the end of the weekend into early next week, that's a lot of cold air in Canada. It's from coast to coast, so that's pretty amazing, and the storm track over us is pretty much west to east. So there's a pretty defined line there where we're going to see an active storm track with cold air lurking. But what happens early next week is the cold air tries to re-intensify and then buckle to the south. Now again, the guidance could flip-flop with this again, but when it dives here, I just was joking about this earlier, if you remember waterbeds, when waterbeds were a thing, one of my friends had one growing up, and the best way I can describe what happens in the atmosphere is when you push really hard here, you force a wave here, and if you ever run a waterbed, you've seen this. Or if you've been in a small pool and your kids take a float and they cause waves by pushing down on the water and the waves go up somewhere else. When you push hard down here with cold air, you force warm air up here, and that's why you can see dramatic changes from warm to cold in a very short period of time. But the cold air doesn't go away. It kind of lingers to our northwest and then tries to move down here late next week. And the thing about late next week, not only does it try to move down here, maybe in a little piece, it also moves down here at the exact same time we get a very active storm track. So while the cold air is backed off a little bit, the pattern to me has actually gotten more interesting because of this going into next weekend. You see this orientation here, which is wild. Huge ridge out west. It's going to be warmer and wet in Edmonton, Canada than it could be in Dallas, Texas late next week. And look at this warm air here, but look at this crazy sharp trough or storm track. I tell you what, that right there, at least from a pattern recognition standpoint, screams winter storm. Now, again, we're talking a week and a half out, so what happens, the details are kind of murky, but this pattern is crazy. And just a couple days ago, it showed Arctic air. Now we see this wild pattern. So when I see this up and down, this wild trough ridge axis, I mean, it's just like huge ridges and troughs. And I talked about this in my winter forecast. I expected we would see a pattern like this develop this winter where we would just see wild patterns of warm and cold. Now watch the Arctic outbreak. This is as of tonight. It moves south this weekend, goes into the Great Lakes, kind of gives us a glancing blow. But then early next week, you know, it looked like it was going to keep moving. It kind of stops. And I'm going to stop this right here. I'm going to let it play out until about Tuesday. So this is the wild thing about this. Look at this pattern. I mean, this is whack. Look at all of that cold air, but look at this little pocket of warm air. So right here is the battle line. So what happened in the last 24 hours, and I'm going to open a window here. I don't know if you probably won't be able to see this. But the models have shifted just slightly, but it's brought dramatic changes in the deterministic temperature. So what I'm going to do is shift the forecast here just a little bit by distance. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the model guidance. I'm going to shift everything west just 100 miles. And this is basically next Tuesday. So let's go to the west 100 miles. So look at the warm air that takes over the Carolinas. But let's shift it east 100 miles. cold air starts moving in. So these subtle shifts east and west, that's how you can see dramatic shifts. And this may not happen at all. I mean, we might see the cold air flip-flop back the other way. That's the thing. Just because it looks like it's warm now, just like we've seen in the last 24 hours, we could see this flip again. But even in this pattern, the cold air is delayed, but it's not gone. Watch what happens late next week. So we go past Wednesday. Wednesday would be fascinating. That's like really warm briefly, and then the bottom drops out as the Arctic front moves through. And by the time we get into late next week, into next weekend, I mean, that's bananas right there to see that much cold air from coast to coast and all the way down into the Gulf. I mean, look at the airflow. It's straight out of the north. Let me play this again. I'll stop it right here. I mean, cold air, look at it. It's all the way down into Mexico. So this is just a crazy pattern. That's why I said hold on to your seatbelts next week, because it's going to be a wild ride. Now, it still looks like it's going to end up being below average. The question is duration and how long, because it could take a while to get all the way down here. But all the pattern looks like, in the long range, it looks like it's going to be below average. That's the 6 to 10 day outlook. And then you look 8 to 14 days, and there isn't a whole lot of change. So overall, it still looks cold. But I wanted to show you this little behind the scenes view here. Hopefully this will work. I'm going to show you. I showed this earlier, but this is a really fascinating chart. Now, we look at these charts quite a bit of the ensembles. When we look at models, we don't look at just a single number. Like a lot of times your typical app pulls a single number out of the model. Even the European model doesn't have a deterministic output. There is one you can look at, but there's actually 51 variations of it, and there's 30-some variations of the GFS. So we call those ensembles. You look at all of these simulations, and you can look at the average. But what's interesting about this is the range. So next week, if you look at some of the ranges, the outliers on these are up around 70, and the other outliers are down around 35. For highs, there's a 70 to 35 degree difference from the high and low, and the mean is really wide. So when these bars are really wide like this, that means there's a lot of uncertainty in the guidance. So all I can tell you is that next week is going to be crazy. We are going to see a wild pattern. Could be really mild at times and wet, and then we could see a dramatic shift to wintry weather. But the winter weather threat is certainly not out of the realm of possibility next week. So don't think that just because it looks warm now early next week that the cold air is not coming, or there's no winter weather in the forecast, or it's not happening at all. What we've seen in the last couple of days is just that the guidance and the pattern is going to be very, very wacky. And when you look at this, I mean, this is just, look at this thing. I'm going to loop this. It is crazy to see. Whoops, I didn't want to do that. Let's go back to that. I was going to the headlines real quick. You get a sneak peek of my headlines. Let me play through this real quick, and you can see how crazy this back and forth motion is. I mean, this is the fluid dynamics of the atmosphere. It is going to be a wild ride. So expect more crazy changes over the next couple of days, and just stay tuned, because I expect we could see even more changes by the time we get to next week. But in particular, watch next weekend, late next week into next weekend, because not only does it look like a cold pattern, but the storm track is pretty crazy. Of course, I'll cover it all and give you updates as we get closer. If anything wild changes,